I don't really know how to begin. I was going to tell you my name, but I see it's right there in front of me, so I guess I'm more important. It's all right. I'll just leave it as Peggy Curlovic right there in front of me. Before I start, though, I wanted to thank all the members of this committee that have worked on this birthday. I had a birthday about 3 or 4 days ago, and it was really nice because my family and my friends all got together and helped me celebrate. And I think that's what these people on the committee for our birthday of the church are going to do. They're getting us all together, and we're going to celebrate our birthday next year. So I wanted to thank Ike especially for all he has done for this, and Beth and Susan and Debbie, and I know there are other people working on it because I've had people tell me they were, so I appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody watching this appreciates it too. I joined First Presbyterian Church in Sumter in the late fall of 1978, which is before a lot of people watching this probably were born. And I joined just a few months after we arrived in Sumter when my husband took a position as a division chair at USC Sumter. And everybody that I met right away thought we were with the Air Force, and I couldn't figure that out until I realized what a prominent place Shaw plays in our community. But we didn't come with the Air Force, we came with the school. And I was very glad to find a Presbyterian church. I had been looking for a Presbyterian church because we came here from the Navajo Nation where we had taught for 5 years. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, but there weren't any Presbyterian churches very close to where we lived. There was a Catholic mission, and many of you all know that my husband is Catholic. So we had a wonderful priest who became a great family friend, and we had Mass in our homes. There were several Catholic families on the faculty at the school where we taught. We had church every week, so I wasn't unchurched, but I was unpresbyterian, and for a cradle Presbyterian, that's a long time to go without your church. So I was happy to find First Presbyterian Church, and a couple of days or maybe a week or two after I first attended, I got a visit from the pastor, who was Dr. Cliff McLeod, and I thought it was wonderful that the pastor of such a large church had taken the time to come and see a visitor. And his wife also introduced herself to me in church, and that was a wonderful experience. So I joined the church probably October or November of that year. About the first or second Sunday when I was sitting right over to what's my left now as I'm facing the sanctuary. And there was an older lady sitting in front of me. I think now when I look back on it that it was Ruth Sanders, whom some of you knew, but at the time I had no idea who she was. And after church that Sunday, she said, "You need to be in the choir." And I had thought about it anyway because I'd always sung in my church choir. So I talked to Bill Scobie, who was the organist and choir master at the time. And I decided to wait until after Christmas because they were practicing for lessons and carols. So I joined the choir in the new year of 1979 and have been a choir member ever since, although I'm taking a little break right now because my husband needs me at home. But that has been my home away from home, I guess you would say, and by far the biggest influence on my life in the church. This is for some of you old timers. About the second time I went to choir rehearsal, this little lady came up to me after the rehearsal and she said, "Now I want you to know that we don't wear perfume in the choir, and we do not wear earrings in the choir loft. We take them off." And I thought, but I don't wear perfume anyway, and I also don't wear earrings. So I passed Mrs. Duffy's approval list, I guess. Mrs. Duffy was probably the longest-lived member that our choir ever had. She sang in the choir for years, and you did not sit in Mrs. Duffy's seat. You had to be sure that you sat somewhere else in the choir loft. It was fun to have lots of friends like that in the choir, and I could name at least 10 people that were close friends who have since left us to join the Heavenly Choir. But I won't go into all those names, but some of you know who they are. The other thing I remember about choir was several years later, we had a new couple that came into the choir. She was very pregnant, so she did not come into the choir until after the baby was born. But he came in, and we all introduced ourselves to him. He introduced himself to us. And I remember the first Sunday I was there, first Wednesday I was there, I thought, I'll never learn all these people's names. But Chuck Feening knew everybody's name that first night by the time he left the choir loft. It was amazing to me that he could remember all of our names. Those are just two choir experiences. The other thing that I think is important in our church, the other two areas that I have had any participation in to a great degree, are the Presbyterian women and the serving as an officer. I've served as an officer under every pastor that we have had, starting with Jeff Aiken. I was a deacon when Jeff was here, and then I was first elected as an elder when Ed McLeod was here. Then we had Mark Durrett and then Nick Cheek, and all kinds of interims in between. And it was interesting as I served in those positions to note the differences among the pastors that we've had. Each pastor that we've had has had his own way of doing things, his own outlook on things, his own way of dealing with different matters that came up, his own level of participation in the community. But I can truly say that serving under all of those pastors was a wonderful experience, and we have been very fortunate in the pastors that we have had, I think. I hope that we can continue to support our pastor as we search now for our new installed pastor. We sure have a nice interim right now, and we all are happy to have Bob with us. But I enjoyed serving as an elder and a deacon. I considered it both a privilege and a responsibility. And I might just add, when I first was nominated to be an elder, that was way a long time ago. And at that time, we nominated half again as many people as were going to serve for the office, and we actually had an election. And the top, I think there were 12 elders in each class at that time, and we nominated 18, so the top 12 people came into office. And that first time that I was nominated, 11 people were elected outright, and there was a tie for the 12th spot between me and Helen Probst. And Helen and the minister said, well, we'll have to have a runoff. We'll have to have another election next week, and the congregation will have to vote, and we'll have ballots and so on. And Helen and I looked at each other, and we thought, we don't want to do that. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. We'll flip for it. And we flipped for it, and Helen won. And so Helen became an elder, and I had to wait until the next time. But it was kind of like they did in the New Testament, I believe, when they chose the disciples after Judas. I think they flipped for it. So we were following good New Testament theology. The other organization that I mentioned was Presbyterian Women, and that organization, I think, has done almost more for this church than any other, because it's been a joke in the Presbyterian Women's organization for years. When something needs to be done, eventually the word comes along, well, let's ask the women, and they do it. And I have enjoyed my circle. I've been Bible teacher in the circle and circle leader, and it's been a real privilege to serve in that organization and to receive the life membership from it. I might just mention one person there, and that's Martha Shaw. Martha was in my circle, and she did everything, and she did many things for the church that people don't even know about. For many years, Martha polished all of the silver that the church owned, the communion service and the collection plates, all by herself. And you could go down there on a Monday morning after we'd had communion, and she'd be in the kitchen polishing the communion service. And Martha was offered a life membership in the Presbyterian Women, but she turned it down because she didn't feel like she deserved the recognition. It's people like Martha, I think, that make the church strong. I don't have any funny things to tell about the church, except that one Sunday when George Jacobs was our, I don't remember whether he was still the assistant pastor or whether he was the interim between pastors, but he came into the choir room. He was ready to go into church, and we looked down, and he had on one black shoe and one brown shoe. And we all thought that was pretty funny, but we decided he'd be far enough away from the congregation that nobody would notice what he had on. But we've had pastors with great senses of humor over the years at this church. There are two things I wanted to just mention, and then I will close this out. The first one is that we've had pastors who were really good preachers. And almost everybody here will say, oh, I like that sermon Sunday, or that sermon really spoke to me, and so on. But when we stop to think about it, how many times do we remember a particular thing in a sermon? Not very often, maybe. But this is one that has stuck with me through the years, and it was from a pastor who wasn't a particularly dynamic preacher. And I've already mentioned him once, but that was Dr. Cliff McLeod. And this was after he had retired, I think, because he retired, I believe, the December after I joined the church in the fall. But he stayed in Sumter for a while, and I think this was probably, he had come back to preach the Thanksgiving sermon. And the text that he used was from Thessalonians, where the Bible says to give thanks in all things. And I still remember I don't know why it struck me, but he made it very clear. He says, you've got to realize that this does not mean that you have to be thankful for everything that happens to you. It does not say to give God thanks for all things. It says give God thanks in all things, because we can be thankful that God is in those things with us, even if they're things that we don't particularly think are good. And that's just stuck with me. I guess it's been 40 years because he's been gone a long time. And the other thing that stuck with me, I don't even know who said it because I don't know his name, but for several years we had Bible school at night. And a couple of those years we actually had Bible school not just for the kids, but for the adults too. And we had a speaker come in and talk on a certain topic for us. And it was always very informal. And I just remember this one year, and I don't know who the man was. I don't know if he was a minister. I think he probably was, but he may have just been a lay scholar. But we were in the fellowship hall, and we were seated around those little round tables that we have. We'd had supper, I think, and it was a very informal thing. And he said, I want to ask you all a question. He said, can anybody give me the definition of a Christian? Well, all these people raised their hands, and so he went to one table and he said, what is a Christian? And the person said, well, Christian's somebody that believes Jesus was the Son of God. And he said, no. So that's not the definition of a Christian. That's something a Christian believes, but that's not what a Christian is. And he asked other questions. He asked other people, and people would say, oh, a Christian, somebody who tries to follow the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. No, that's what a Christian does, but that's not what a Christian is. So nobody could satisfy him. We were all sitting there wondering, well, what does he think a Christian is? And finally he said, a Christian is a person in whom the Spirit of Christ dwells. And to me, that was the best definition of a Christian that I had ever heard. And it has stuck with me for many years because I think that that's my prayer for our church, that we can be people in whom the Spirit of Christ is indwelling, to use an old English word, and in all that we do, in our worship, in our community service, in our relationships with each other, that we can truly be Christians and not just do things that we think Christians do.